there is a pattern in human history that has no parallel. Every major empire that has ever existed has eventually disappeared. The Babylonians are gone, the Assyrians are gone, the Persians are gone, the Greeks are gone, the Romans are gone, the Ottomans are gone, the British Empire is gone. Every civilization that has ever risen to dominate the known world has eventually collapsed, dissolved, been absorbed, or transformed beyond recognition. One people has outlasted all of them. A people that has been enslaved in Egypt, conquered by Assyria, exiled to Babylon, subjugated by Persia, Hellenized by Greece, crushed by Rome, scattered across the known world, expelled from England in 1290 and from Spain in 1492, massacred in the Crusades, burned in the Inquisition, and systematically murdered in the most industrialized genocide in human history, has not only survived, but has returned to the land from which it was expelled 2,000 years ago and reconstituted itself as a functioning nation state. This is, by any historical measure, the most extraordinary story of national survival in human history. And it has been accompanied from the beginning to the present day by a hostility so consistent, so persistent, so geographically widespread, and so disproportionate to any rational explanation that it demands a serious examination. Why do the nations hate Israel? Not as a political question about Middle Eastern policy, not as a question about the specific actions of a specific government, as a historical question about a pattern that has repeated itself across 4,000 years of human history in cultures and religions and political systems so different from each other that they share almost nothing except this one consistent feature: the desire to eliminate the Jewish people and their claim to a specific piece of land. The Bible has answers to this question, not comfortable answers, not simple answers, but answers that, when you examine them carefully through the lens of the texts themselves and the history that is unfolded around them, are more interesting and more illuminating than anything modern political analysis has produced. This video is not a political video. It does not take sides on any contemporary conflict. It does not argue for any specific policy position. It is a video about what the biblical tradition itself, across the Hebrew prophets, the New Testament, and the interpretive traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, says about why the nations have consistently opposed Israel and what that consistent opposition means within the framework of the biblical worldview. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. Before we go into the 5 biblical reasons, we need to establish something that most discussions of this topic either assume without examining or dismiss without engaging: the biblical claim about Israel's unique status in history and what that claim actually means in the texts. The Hebrew Bible makes a claim that is, by any historical standard, extraordinary. It claims that a specific people, descended from a specific man named Abraham, were chosen by the creator of the universe for a specific purpose, given a specific land, and placed at the center of a story that would eventually involve all the nations of the earth. The covenant described in Genesis 12, where God tells Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation and that all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through him, is the foundational claim around which the entire biblical narrative is organized. This is not a modest claim. It is not a claim that one ethnic group is superior to others in any ordinary sense. The Hebrew Bible is brutally honest about Israel's failures, rebellions, and moral catastrophes in ways that no purely nationalistic mythology ever is. It is rather a claim about function, about a specific role in a specific story. Israel is chosen not because it is the greatest nation, but because it is the instrument through which something is supposed to happen in human history. What that something is has been interpreted differently by different traditions. The Jewish tradition understands it as the preservation and transmission of the Torah, the revelation of God's will for human life. The Christian tradition understands it as the preparation for the coming of the Messiah, through whom the covenant with Abraham is extended to all nations. The Islamic tradition understands it as one stage in the progressive revelation that culminates in the Quran and the prophethood of Muhammad. But all three traditions agree on the foundational structure. Israel occupies a unique place in the story of the relationship between God and humanity, and that unique place, whatever else it means, is the beginning of any biblical answer to why the nations have consistently opposed it. Now let us go into the 5 reasons. The first reason is what the biblical tradition calls the cosmic dimension of the conflict. The claim that the opposition to Israel is not merely a human phenomenon, but has a supernatural dimension rooted in the spiritual war described across the biblical texts. This is the reason that is most alien to modern secular sensibility and most central to the biblical worldview. The Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and, in its own way, the Quran all describe a universe in which the material world is the stage for a conflict that extends into spiritual dimensions invisible to ordinary human perception. The forces that oppose God's purposes in the world are not merely human. They operate through human history, but are not reducible to human motivations. The prophet Daniel, in chapters 10 through 12, describes a vision in which an angelic figure explains that he had been delayed in reaching Daniel because he was opposed by the prince of Persia, a supernatural being who opposed the purposes of God working through the Persian Empire. The same passage mentions the prince of Greece, another supernatural being. The biblical text describes a structure in which each nation has a corresponding supernatural power, and the conflict between nations in the material world mirrors a conflict between supernatural powers in the spiritual dimension. This is not a peripheral or marginal element of the biblical worldview. The Apostle Paul, in the letter to the Ephesians, writes explicitly, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The book of Revelation describes cosmic powers that work through earthly empires to oppose the purposes of God. Within this framework, the consistent, persistent, geographically widespread hatred of Israel across 4,000 years of human history is not merely a sociological or psychological phenomenon to be explained by prejudice or economic competition or religious difference. It is a manifestation of a cosmic conflict in which the existence and the purposes of the Jewish people are opposed by spiritual forces that operate through human hatred. The medieval Jewish philosopher Judah Halevi, writing in the 12th century in his philosophical dialogue, the Kuzari, develops this cosmic dimension of Israel's situation with extraordinary sophistication. He describes Israel as the heart of humanity, the most sensitive and most vulnerable organ of the human body, the one that feels most intensely both the health and the disease of the whole. The nations hate Israel in Halevi's framework because Israel's existence and faithfulness is a continuous reminder of the claims that the God of Israel makes on all of human life, claims that the nations find intolerable precisely because they are true. This is a theological argument that cannot be evaluated on purely empirical grounds, but it is the argument that the biblical tradition itself makes, and it provides a framework within which the otherwise inexplicable consistency of the opposition to Israel across cultures and centuries and political systems makes a kind of sense that purely materialistic explanations have never fully provided. The second reason is the election and the covenant. The biblical claim that Israel's chosen status generates a specific kind of resentment that has no parallel in the resentment that other peoples have generated. The claim of election, the claim that a specific people has been singled out by the creator of the universe for a specific relationship and a specific purpose, is inherently provocative. It is not merely a claim that one group is better than another, which is a claim that many groups have made throughout history without generating the same quality and quantity of opposition. It is a claim that the universe has a moral structure, that history has a direction and a purpose, and that a specific people is at the center of that structure and that direction. This claim if true, delegitimizes every alternative claim to ultimate significance. If the God of Abraham is the creator of the universe and has chosen the descendants of Abraham as his covenant people, then the gods of every other nation are not gods. The ultimate significance that every other culture has built its life around is not ultimate. And the claim of every empire to permanent divine sanction is false. The Romans did not simply resent Jewish political resistance. Roman imperial theology, the claim that Rome was the eternal order of things, was directly contradicted by the Jewish prophetic tradition, which said that all empires fall and that the only eternal kingdom is the one God will establish through his covenant people. This is not a minor theological disagreement. It is an existential conflict between two incompatible worldviews about the nature of history and the location of ultimate authority. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, writing about anti-Semitism from a completely secular perspective in his 1946 essay Anti-Semite and Jew, reached a conclusion that, without using theological language, describes the same dynamic. Sartre argued that the anti-Semite hates the Jew not for specific qualities the Jew possesses, but because the Jew represents, in the anti-Semite's imagination, a living challenge to the world the anti-Semite has constructed. The Jew exists outside the national story, outside the ethnic homogeneity, outside the closed system of meaning that the anti-Semite requires. The Jew is the reminder that the system is not closed, that the story is not complete, that there is something outside the world the anti-Semite has built. Sartre was describing a secular sociological phenomenon, but his description maps almost exactly onto the biblical account of why the nations hate Israel. Israel's existence is a challenge to every closed system of meaning. It is a living claim that the universe has a moral structure that supersedes every human construction. And that claim is intolerable to every system that wants to be the final word about human life. The scholar Leon Kass of the University of Chicago, in his extended commentary on the Book of Genesis, argues that the founding of the Jewish people through the covenant with Abraham was the introduction into human history of a completely new principle. The idea that a people could be defined not by ethnicity or geography or military power, but by a relationship with a transcendent moral authority. Every other ancient people defined itself by its connection to a specific land, a specific ancestry, a specific pantheon of gods connected to that land and ancestry. Israel defined itself by a covenant with a God who could not be localized to any specific place, who demanded justice and righteousness rather than sacrifice and ritual, and who claimed authority over all nations rather than just one. This was a revolutionary and deeply threatening idea, and the nations have been responding to it with hostility ever since. The third reason is the land. The biblical claim that a specific piece of geography, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, has been given by the creator of the universe to a specific people as a permanent inheritance is the most geopolitically explosive theological claim in human history. Genesis 15:18 describes God making a covenant with Abraham. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Deuteronomy 30 describes the restoration of the people to this land as a central element of the ultimate divine redemption. The prophets consistently describe the land of Israel as the place from which the divine purposes for all humanity will emanate in the Messianic era. The claim of permanent divine grant to a specific land is not a claim that has ever been made to go away by military defeat, political dispossession, or physical exile. The Jewish people were expelled from the land by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE and spent 19 centuries in diaspora. During those 19 centuries, they never stopped praying for return, never stopped facing Jerusalem in prayer, never stopped incorporating the land into every dimension of their liturgical and cultural life. And in the 20th century, they returned. The establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 was, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable fulfillment of the biblical promises or a massive geopolitical injustice, or both simultaneously. And the question of how to hold those two perspectives together is one of the most difficult in contemporary ethics. But what the biblical tradition says about the land is not ambiguous. The claim of the Jewish people to this specific territory is grounded in a covenant that the tradition presents as permanent and irrevocable. Every empire that has ever controlled the land of Israel has eventually lost it. The Egyptians lost it. The Assyrians lost it. The Babylonians lost it. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the Arab Caliphates, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and the British Mandate all controlled the land and all eventually lost control of it. The biblical tradition presents this not as a coincidence, but as a reflection of the land's unique status in the divine economy. The hostility toward Israel that centers on the land question is therefore, from within the biblical framework, not merely a territorial dispute. It is a conflict over whether the biblical covenant is real. If the Jewish people's return to the land after 2,000 years of exile is the fulfillment of prophecy, as the Jewish and many Christian traditions maintain, then the opposition to that return is opposition to a divine purpose. And within the biblical worldview, opposition to divine purposes is the defining characteristic of the forces the tradition describes as evil. The fourth reason is the Torah and the moral demands it introduces into human history. The Hebrew Bible and the Torah at its center introduced into human civilization a set of moral demands that have never been entirely comfortable for any culture that has encountered them. The demand for justice for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the prohibition of usury and exploitation, the Sabbath as a radical democratization of rest, in which even slaves were to rest one day in 7, directly challenging the economic systems that depended on unlimited human labor. The Jubilee year, in which debts were canceled and slaves freed and land returned to its original owners, a built-in limit on the accumulation of wealth and power that no economic system built on unlimited accumulation has ever found tolerable. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was not a friend of the Jewish tradition, understood this dynamic more clearly than most of his contemporaries. He described what he called the slave revolt in morality, by which he meant the introduction into Western civilization through the Hebrew Bible and its Christian inheritor of a moral framework that elevated the weak, the poor, the suffering, and the oppressed at the expense of the strong, the powerful, and the victorious. Nietzsche hated this development, but his description of it is accurate. The Hebrew prophets are the origin of the Western tradition's insistence that the strong have obligations to the weak that supersede the logic of power. Every system built on the unrestrained exercise of power has recognized in the Jewish moral tradition its primary opponent. This is not a coincidence. The Torah is not merely a religious document for one ethnic community. It is a moral challenge to the entire structure of human civilization. And the civilizations that have most violently opposed it have often been the ones that most clearly understood what it was challenging. The 20th century philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who survived the Holocaust and spent his career developing a philosophy of ethics based on the biblical tradition of responsibility for the other, argued that the hatred of the Jews is ultimately a hatred of the demand for justice that the Jewish tradition has introduced into human consciousness. The anti-Semite hates not the Jews as people, but the moral claim that Jewish existence makes. The claim that every human being, even the weakest and most marginal, has infinite dignity that places demands on every other human being. That claim is intolerable to every system that wants to exercise power without accountability. The fifth reason is the prophetic witness, the historical role of the Jewish people as the carriers of a testimony about the nature of reality that the world has consistently found intolerable. The Hebrew prophets were not comfortable people. Amos condemned the wealthy for exploiting the poor. Isaiah condemned the political leadership for trusting in military alliances rather than in God. Jeremiah told the people that the Babylonian conquest was God's judgment on their unfaithfulness, and that resistance to Babylon was resistance to God's purposes. A message so politically unacceptable that he was imprisoned and accused of treason. Ezekiel delivered messages so disturbing that his contemporaries refused to take them seriously. And across all of them, the consistent message was, the world as it is not the world as it should be. And the God of Israel will not be satisfied with arrangements that benefit the powerful at the expense of the weak. This prophetic tradition has not ended with the Hebrew prophets. The Jewish people throughout their history have disproportionately produced voices that challenge the established order, that refuse to accept the existing arrangements as final, that insisted on the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. This is not a claim about Jewish superiority. It is an observation about a function that the tradition itself describes as inherent to the covenant calling. The historian Paul Johnson, in his monumental History of the Jews, argues that the Jewish contribution to Western civilization's development of moral and political consciousness is so disproportionate to the Jewish people's numerical size that it can only be explained by something specific and unique about the Jewish tradition and its demands on its carriers. Whether that something specific is theological, as the tradition itself claims, or cultural and intellectual, as secular historians prefer to explain it, is a question that the evidence alone cannot answer. What the evidence does show is that the Jewish prophetic tradition has consistently produced voices that the established order has found threatening, and the established order has consistently responded to those voices with hostility disproportionate to any rational threat assessment. Karl Marx came from a Jewish family and developed the most influential challenge to capitalist economic structures in modern history. Sigmund Freud came from a Jewish family and developed the most influential challenge to the rational self-conception of modern humanity. Albert Einstein came from a Jewish family and developed the most influential challenge to the Newtonian understanding of physical reality that had organized Western science for 2 centuries. These are not coincidences. They are the expression in secular form of a tradition that has always insisted that the world as it appears is not the world as it ultimately is, and that the comfortable assumptions of the powerful are not the final word about reality. The nations hate Israel from this perspective because Israel's existence and witness is a continuous challenge to every comfortable assumption about the permanence of existing arrangements. Israel is the reminder that nothing is permanent except the purposes of the God who made the covenant with Abraham, that everything built on injustice will eventually fall, that the story is not over, that the final chapter has not yet been written, and that reminder is intolerable to every civilization that wants to believe it is the final chapter. Now, step back and look at the 5 reasons together. The cosmic dimension. The opposition to Israel reflects a supernatural conflict that operates through human history. The election and the covenant. Israel's chosen status is a provocation to every alternative claim to ultimate significance. The land, the biblical covenant's territorial dimension, generates a geopolitical conflict that is ultimately a theological conflict. The Torah. The moral demands of the Hebrew Bible are intolerable to every system built on unaccountable power. The prophetic witness, Israel's historical role as the carrier of a testimony about the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be, generates hostility from every established order that prefers the world as it is. These are not 5 separate and unrelated explanations. They are 5 facets of the same fundamental dynamic. The existence of the Jewish people is a challenge to the world's comfortable arrangements, and the world has responded to that challenge with hostility across 4,000 years of history. Whether you read this dynamic as evidence for the truth of the biblical worldview, as a remarkable historical pattern that demands explanation but can be explained without theology, or as something in between, the pattern itself is undeniable. The hostility to Israel is one of the most consistent and most disproportionate phenomena in human history. and it deserves a more serious analysis than it usually receives. Here is the question I want to leave you with. If the biblical tradition is right, that Israel's existence and purpose are connected to the ultimate moral structure of the universe, then the opposition to Israel is not merely a political phenomenon to be resolved by negotiation and compromise. It is a manifestation of something deeper, something that will not be resolved by any human political arrangement, however wise or just. And if the biblical tradition is wrong, if Israel is simply a nation among nations with no special cosmic significance, then the disproportionate hatred it has generated across 4,000 years of human history is itself one of the most extraordinary and most inexplicable phenomena in the entire human record. And it demands an explanation that secular analysis has not yet produced with any consistency. Uh, Either way, the question is real. Either way, it matters. Either way, it deserves more than the superficial political analysis it usually receives. The nations have hated Israel for 4,000 years across every culture and every political system and every religious tradition that has ever encountered it. Something is happening in that pattern, and whatever it is not finished yet.